The UN confidently states that the practice of criminal financing is becoming a predominant activity in market economies. We're accepting drug money. How is it acceptable for the government to allow the sale of drugs for economical gain, but at the same time punish the consumers of the product? I mean, the money ultimately comes from them. The illegal use of drugs ought to be considered as a matter of public health, not of criminal justice. I affirm this matter must not be considered the responsibility of the courts, rather directed towards social welfare initiatives. For the purpose of this text, illegal use will be considered the abuse of drugs to self-soothe. The drugs we'll refer to are illegal substances whose possession can result in punitive damages. The framework of public health are those which are under the authority of the community and free agencies like Alcoholics Anonymous and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And criminal justice will be acutely considered the process in which the judicial system incarcerates drug users. I value social welfare. Social welfare is the concept where personal drive and policies are aimed at improving the overall quality of life for individuals in a society. The criterion with which I evaluate the success of this value is the creation of healthier, more trusting communities. The reasons the proposition I'm setting forth must be the case is because rehabilitation is more effective at treating addiction. Also, the criminalization of drugs is unconstitutional and poor expenditure of taxpayer money. Addressing the use of drugs as a public health matter promotes rehabilitation over punishment. According to addiction counselor Steve Rose, drugs themselves don't cause addiction. It's repressed trauma, pain, and unmet needs that ignite this behavior. A study that examined the impact of having purpose in life found that it led to decreasing rates of relapse and frequency of use of drugs. A common practice to achieve this was cognitive behavioral therapy. According to psychologist Craig Haney, in order for inmates to survive, they had to subject themselves to psychological damage that disconnected them from their families, created mood disorders, and makes them forget their purpose in life. When it comes down to how to solve addiction problems, we must look towards those who specialize in recovery. At large, the common theme among recovery centers for inducing sobriety or abstinence is finding the root cause of addiction. The criminal justice system treats drug use as if it is a lack of moral discipline or willpower that can be stopped by simply choosing to, but that's not the case. The National Institute on Drug Abuse states that a combination of elements, including environmental factors from childhood, increase the chance of developing addiction. This means its onset is already unknowingly predetermined. For this reason, punishing addicts and making them suffer is not incentive enough to get them to stop. The issue falls within their subconscious, out of reach of their decision-making conscious mind. In fact, Craig Haney believes incarcerating drug users will only add on to the emotional and mental turmoil they're already experiencing. If our goal is to decrease the use of drugs, then punishment would work against our efforts. Since we have linked having purpose in life to reducing drug use, and we know incarceration generally strips inmates of their purpose, we must not act blindly for the sake of continuing to do something on the premise of that's how it's always been done. We must go in the direction of positive results. This would mean supporting rehabilitation. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is able to address the marks of distress from childhood that created the addiction in the first place. Moreover, it teaches drug users skills that gives them a sense of hope and confidence which convey the idea that there is purpose in continuing to try to recover. This way, we would be giving them personal management skills and the tools to continue their abstinence journey on their own. Punishing individuals instead of handling them with effective treatment for substance-related problems is a missed opportunity to promote public health and safety. To increase discernment on how to live a healthier life without drugs, we must focus on social welfare. As we see, drug use is an internal struggle. For this reason, we ought to discourage policies that promote social isolation. Addressing drug use as the responsibility of the criminal justice system is fundamentally unconstitutional. Nixon's criminalization of drugs has led to rising levels of disproportionate incarceration of poor people and people of color since the 1970s, while simultaneously failing to reduce drug use and drug-related harm. In contrast, Portugal decriminalized the possession of drugs by reorientating policy towards a public health approach. This resulted in destigmatizing drug abuse and the decrease of drug-related deaths as well as addiction because the money formerly spent on incarcerating drug users was instead used to fund agencies to help them find and form communities. Through a series of experiments on rats, Professor Alexander, an honored psychologist, was able to deduce that the ones living in social environment were less likely to self-administer drugs than those living in isolation. After Richard Nixon started the war on drugs, the U.S. male incarceration rate increased almost 5 times, resulting in its intended effect to separate families of ethnic descent. An advisor of Richard Nixon, John Ehrlichman, confessed that the drug war was imposed so Nixon can combat the anti-war left and correlate drug use with minorities in order to stigmatize and criminalize both of them, to raid their homes, lock up their leaders, and break up their meetings. He appealed to the law to mark drug users as criminals, and society followed suit by stigmatizing drug consumption. It's clear the law spread stigma on drug use, and social stigma supported the law. Without the stigma on drug consumption, Nixon wouldn't have had lawful support because it goes against the First Amendment to place restrictions on speeches and gatherings based on subject matter and viewpoints. For this reason, the initial intent to treat drug use as a matter of criminal justice system was unconstitutional. It also violated the 14th Amendment in that the disproportionate incarceration of minorities deprived them of their constitutional right to have equal protection under the law. Ipso facto, supporting the criminalization of drug use is unconstitutional. So at what point do we consider new ways of addressing this issue? Because stigma shapes social interactions in a way that restricts the well-being of those under question, continuing to allow the criminal justice system to deal with drug use as a crime is an act against its own citizens' well-being. To put it clearly, criminalizing drugs puts a barrier between drug users and the ability to connect with others, which according to behavioral psychologists is what has the highest chance of reducing drug use. We have much to learn from Portugal, who was once ridden with an addiction epidemic. When they decriminalized drug use, stigma declined and people were more inclined to reach out for support. This resulted in a healthier community because people were able to find reasons and company worth staying sober for. To summarize, the opposite of addiction is community, and the government can support this by redirecting drug use as a matter of public health, since incarceration is synonymous to social isolation. Besides, laws designed to deter crime are ineffective partly because criminals know little about the law. Therefore, supporting social welfare initiatives would do more to deter drug use than laws themselves. Apart from forming a community, the government owes a duty to its citizens to partition tax dollars sensibly. The criminal justice system spends too much money on incarcerating drug offenders. A report from the National Drug Intelligence Center declared that $113 billion spent in 2007 was associated with drug-related crime, including criminal justice system costs such as criminal investigation, prosecution, and incarceration. Whereas the same report showed that the cost of treating drug use, such as health costs, hospitalization, and government specialty treatment, was estimated to be $14.6 billion, only a fraction of the first amount of money spent. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a study done in California showed that engagement in treatment was associated with lower costs of crime in their communities in the 6 months following their release. When asking forensic psychiatrists about the criminal reactions of drug addicted offenders, they affirmed that incarceration is criminogenic and increases reoffense. When we subject criminals to prison culture, we desocialize them by pulling them apart from their family and social relationships. Breaking their bonds also results from the existing prejudice and stigma society has on the incarcerated population. The combination of these factors can culminate in an effect opposite to what is desired and thus potentiate criminal behavior rather than seize it. According to the National Institute of Justice, incarcerating in varying degrees of punishment do very little to deter crime. We've seen that rehabilitation is more effective at reducing drug use than incarceration. The previous figures given conclude that not only is treatment more economical as a present expense, but it also reduces the likelihood of having to continue spending on the same offender. Now we should consider the impact that incarcerating drug users has on the economy. In contrast, incarceration is more expensive and it creates the likelihood that the government will have to continue incarcerating the same offender. The only logical solution is, if we're trying to reduce both drug use and tax burden, is to change the system. When drug use is considered a public health concern, the burden on the taxpayer dampens. Therefore, in terms of expenditure, social welfare approaches are superior. Again, I affirm, the illegal use of drugs ought to be considered a problem capable of being resolved by the community, not the criminal justice system. The public health framework has the power to bring awareness of preventative measures, personalized care, and form community immersion projects. Drug use can be better deterred with rehabilitation and ought to be addressed that way because it is fundamentally unconstitutional and a more expensive option of treatment anyways. Social welfare is most easily accomplished through community involvement, not detention, not lawful detention. In conclusion, the question for how to solve substance abuse is not how long of a sentence, it's why the pain.